Malinda Lowery, welcome to The Road to Now.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for being here. This topic, having you on, was like a ray of light came down upon me. Thinking about what to air around this election, thinking about, sometimes we forget the importance of history. We get wrapped up in the moment. Mm-hmm. And I started reading, and I realized there's this perfect entry into talking about Lumbee history, which I've always wanted to do an episode on.
Oh, thanks.
Oh, absolutely. I'm from North Carolina. I grew up in Cabarrus County. And so, I grew up around people who were Lumbee. My dad's from down east in Currituck. And so they were kind of part of our world. And then you go other places and you realize that they're not the part of other people's worlds, right? They don't exist in a lot of ways in people's imaginations. And, as I'll say as we go on, your book only and your work only reinforce the idea that understanding and remembering these histories is vital. But let's just start off with the hook rolling out of the 2020 election. What I found fascinating was, to this point, the Lumbee Tribe, which you are a member of, which you write the history of, they have not gotten federal recognition from the government. They've been somewhat pseudo-recognized, but they've not been allocated the resources and the rights that other tribes get. And in this election, North Carolina is a swing state. The Lumbee are the largest tribe east of the Mississippi, 55,000 strong, predominantly in North Carolina. And suddenly, both major candidates for office decided that they would come out just a month before the election and pledge their loyalty to getting you guys federal recognition.
Undying loyalty. Right? What a shock. Hey, Dana.
So let's start with that. I don't want to interject my sentiment as the first, but I wonder if it's the same. What is the general Lumbee sentiment towards these candidates coming out and making this pledge right now?
Well, it runs the gamut. Of all the opinions are there. I think some see it as a fairly cynical, play for votes, with the conviction that, either candidate would have made strides to make this happen earlier, if they were so committed to it. I think others, are just deeply excited, as you can understand, that the nation kind of has their eye on this issue for just a minute, and we've been fighting this battle since the 1880s. And so thinking about visibility has often, that is the kind of crux of Native futures in some ways. I think everywhere in the United States, we consistently encounter invisibility. So the fact that it's getting some attention statewide, locally, nationally, it really means a lot to folks. That said, I have my own sort of opinions about how much a president can affect federal recognition. It's not really set up for the president to have any real influence, but it provides a kind of morale boost for a lot of folks.
Yeah, this is plays into the greater what I perceive as like the problems of politics, where we think the president does everything when in fact Indian Affairs has been it's a congressional matter, right?
Congressional. Also, the Department of the Interior has a huge role to play, and that's part of the executive branch. So the closest we've gotten to federal recognition since 1950s was under President Obama. He set the tone in the Department of the Interior for a policy change that would make it possible for Lumbees to engage the process. But we didn't get all the way there. Part of it's timing, part of it's just a whole variety of things. In terms of the strategy we've been pursuing, if it's not through the Department of the Interior, then it's through Congress. And it's nice for presidents to sign legislation that Congress passes. Dwight Eisenhower signed our recognition bill from 1956. And we fully expect that this next president will do the same.
Yes, whoever it is.
Whoever it is.
Well, there you go. So let's go back to this, because I think the whole crux of this is the idea that somehow or another the Lumbee have been left out. And so, for someone listening right now who says, well, we understand that there's been a fight for federal recognition of Native Americans. We understand there's been a general kind of silence about them in our narratives. But how is it that the Lumbee themselves, I think there's two questions we could kind of start off with, which is one, why have the Lumbees been separated from the other tribes? And then, actually, no, let's just do that one first because the other one's big too. So why have they been separated in the sense of legislation and in a lot of people's mindset?
Yeah. So it's a complicated question, but I'll start just with the invisibility piece. So our national narratives about Native people, first of all, are long ago and far away. I mean, if you ever learned anything about natives in school, it was not natives in the contemporary sense. It was not who we are now. And it was a history that mostly involves how settlers in the United States have dealt with so-called savages trying to, exercise their righteous manifest destiny to overcome this wilderness, right? That's just where we hear about Native people in that part of American history. And that, of course, is a total distortion from what Native people mean to the country legally and in every other respect. But it's also a total distortion of what Native people do and are today. And so the other piece of that is that we never hear about Native people on the East Coast. And we hear even less about Native people in the South, except probably during the Trail of Tears, when, of course, there's this tragic story that matches that kind of frontier, overcoming the savagery of the wilderness narrative. So Native people that weren't removed, like us, have just never been part of American classrooms. They're not, they're misunderstood widely because of the racial binary in the South. There's kind of a notion of a black-white division in the southern U.S., and anybody who's other in that division is usually characterized as black.
Right.
And so historically, Lumbees have suffered inaccurate racial labels, which have made us invisible to a lot of the scholars and other observers who would otherwise be documenting our community. And that kind of documentation has produced recognition for a number of other tribes in the southern United States. But racial mislabeling and a host of other concerns have meant that Lumbees have kind of been isolated in some degree from scrutiny, which helps us, right? It helps us thrive on our self-determination, our self-governance powers when people are mostly leaving us alone. But, local white supremacists were not leaving us alone. They're exploiting our labor, they're stealing our land, they're mischaracterizing us, our identities are erased from public records up until the late 19th century mostly. And so, other people are conveniently, I think, able to ignore us because we're not ignored by our local neighbors.
I wonder, this goes back to a conversation I had about an unrelated topic, which I won't get into, but the idea was that when people in power look at people who they perceive as powerless, at least, right? And then they say, well, we should help those people. A lot of times, like, the narrative of help hinges upon the idea that, one, the other side needs your help and that you actually know the best way to give the help. And so the story that gets told in this, in this kind of idea that a friend of mine shared with me, the idea that gets shared with this is that you almost, for this to work, you need the other side to appear powerless. And it strikes me in reading your work and becoming more familiar with Lumbee history, it's really hard to make the Lumbee out as being powerless.
Yeah. We're always standing up and saying no. We're always arguing. We're always pushing back. We're always creating like our own world in this otherwise very compromised, colonized situation. And so, yeah, basically everything that's laid upon us since the arrival of Europeans, we've resisted. That's somewhat becomes a very complicated situation in the 20th century when economic opportunity is made open to a lot more people, when civil rights are made more available to people of color in the United States. You see this sort of division in our community between people who want to accommodate whites to receive that help, especially the kind of the acquisition of rights that we had been denied, such as, you know, the right to own land, for example, the right to attend white schools, the right to have a job other than sharecropping or farming. But, you know, the accomplishment of those rights has been really important to all of our folks. Some people talk about that as needing help, and it has been effective in lots of ways. Other folks talk about the accomplishment of rights as things we're owed, because we're a nation that predates the existence of the United States. It's
Right.
our land. You know, we were never removed. These folks came over, you know, they established this government without our permission and then decided to exclude us from it.
Yeah.
And so the folks that are saying we're going to resist and we're going to say no are often the ones that are also articulating this idea that y'all need our permission to be here. And if you haven't asked for permission, then we don't want anything to, you know, we're not going to just accommodate you. So, yeah.
So this gets into the question as well, which is going to be my follow up, in my 2-part question that the first part was too complicated, even in its own. But how is it, if you look at the Lumbee, they have stayed, right? That they have maintained their land. It's not for lack of force, the access to force, right? That the federal government has not, you know, every other group, it seems like, have come at the other end of the sword at some point in time to be pushed off the land. How was it that the Lumbee were able to maintain themselves there and not fall victim to policies like, you know, list it, you know, throughout American history? Yeah,
Yeah.
removal.
Well, certainly in the 20th centuries, we have had to deal with a lot of those damaging policies. But before the Civil War, you know, Lumbees were citizens of the state of North Carolina. Before 1835, our men had the right to vote, for example. Native people that lived on so-called Indians not taxed in the U.S. Constitution were Native people who lived on land that was not privately owned. And so around the time of the American Revolution and after that, before that too, Lumbee people were owning their land privately. And that land ownership meant that we were citizens when the state of North Carolina was created. The Cherokee Nation, for example, then in Georgia and Tennessee and Alabama and South Carolina, were not private landowners. They owned improvements on their land, but they did not own the deeds to parcels of land themselves. And so they were not citizens of the state of Georgia, and the federal government, you know, basically, well, they didn't have to seek Georgia's permission, but Georgia was like, have at it, get rid of these people. They're not our citizens. They don't deserve any legal protection that the state can provide. So Lumbees with a different history of land ownership have avoided a number of policies, most especially removal because of the way citizenship was evolving at that time. But the policies that have the most sort of negative impact, I think, on Native people, the most long-lasting negative impact, are the ones that have explicitly to do with land, because that is the thing, other than our bodies, that is the thing that settlers want. They want our land. And so all this whole policy regime, no matter which decade you're in, one way or another ties back to getting land. Our ancestors, but for a variety of other reasons, you know, related to our residence here, had owned these deeds to land privately. And so they could not, they went about taking our land in other ways, in other respects, but particularly in the post-revolution era, settlers were not able to create a legal tool, like a treaty, for example, for Indians not taxed, to seize what we had. And so we stayed. So the other policies that have been crafted since then around land grabs just haven't materialized heavily in our community.
That's fascinating. almost like being that early on, like the engagement that early on. They hadn't come up with the tools they use later on.
Right, they hadn't come up with the tools yet, and where we were located, the British Empire and the Spanish and the others invaders that were coming up with the tools were not aware of us because we lived in deeply swampy, undesirable territory for Europeans. It was also ungoverned by the state of North Carolina or the colony of North Carolina or South Carolina. And so we were just off the radar for long enough until when we popped on the radar, we already had our own together.
Wow. Wow. So, I mean, it is fascinating. Geography matters so much, so much in American history. Let's go back to the origins because, I myself grew up hearing stories about the history of the Lumbee. I teach U.S. history, and I briefly go into, the lost colony and all of this. And my father grew up hearing stories that he told me. From what I've gathered, within the Lumbee narrative, there is actually you use the word appropriation of the lost cause story in that narrative. Could you tell us how those two interact?
The lost cause or the lost colony?
Sorry, yeah. Well, actually, that's funny because when I wrote this note down, I wrote lost cause because I'm getting more into the mid 19th century, and then I thought from lost colony to lost cause would probably be a good title for something. Anyway,
they're related.
Yeah. So to the lost colony. Yeah, sorry.
So how the lost colony gets kind of appropriated by Lumbees.
Yes.
To serve our purposes. Well, people give the lost colony and its fate way more notice than it deserves. The real story there is like, what are Native people doing at that time in that place to cope with European settlers? Not what happened to these poor white people who were, cast out in the wilderness or whatever. So it's only really in the 19th century, like right around the time of the Civil War, maybe a little bit before that white North Carolinians are like, hey, we have something important to contribute to American history. Let's elevate this, right? And the narrative of the lost colony is like, yeah, the poor white people cast out in the wilderness. That's a perfect origin story for white supremacy in the United States. It presents a weakened, victimized group of people who are very fragile, who are not really innocent. I mean, they are innocent. They're innocent, they're fragile, they're compromised, they're victims of native savagery and dastardly stuff. And yet, look what happened since then. They wind up, conquering the wilderness. They wind up conquering the natives. They wind up establishing this so-called great civilization here on this continent, despite this deep fragility and innocence and all this stuff. So it's a story, it's a narrative that holds white supremacy blameless for the destruction that it's caused for Native people.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. It's just like it's a phenomenal how such a counterintuitive thing could serve a purpose, a really instrumental purpose. So of course, Lumbee people in the 1860s and 1870s are looking at the evolution of this narrative, and there's lots of historical evidence, both written down and oral tradition, that identified that many of our ancestors were English. We spoke a dialect of English that was very unique. It had a Harker's Island kind of feel, that territory. It had a Elizabethan English kind of twang to it. A lot of our vocabulary, our customs, are things. Highland Scots particularly came into our settlement. They thought they recognized us as descendants of a kind of Elizabethan era England culture. So they started writing about that stuff. And it was sort of not too long before the dots were connected to say the Lumbees must be descendants of the lost colony. That's the only thing that could explain this sort of unique relationship to English language and English culture that our ancestors possessed. And so, because, again, like all the reasons why the lost colony was already a powerful narrative, they had this group of people that they also couldn't explain. They couldn't explain how we were Indians, but also so linked to English cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's 1,000 other explanations for that, not the lost colony, but that particular link becomes this really interesting cocktail party moment. We had cocktail parties in the 1870s, it would become a topic of conversation, and a very easy way to comprehend who we were as Indian people when we were not black and we were not white. We were something else. So Lumbees then began to take that narrative and use it as a way to justify the creation of segregated schools. Now, they're buying into a lot when they're doing that. They're buying into a white supremacist logic of racial hierarchy when they're doing that.
And this is in the late 19th century, correct?
Yeah, 1880s, basically.
When the Jim Crow's coming in, creating segregated schools, and the state of North Carolina says, "Look, Lumbee, if you'll be quiet about it, like we'll give you your own schools."
Yep. We will recognize you as a tribe. That's where our state recognition comes from, was that time period. And in recognizing you as a tribe, we will explain your existence as a tribe by linking you to the lost colony. And we will provide you with separate schools, because separate schools also affirm the logic of white supremacy. It also affirms that people should be separate. People cannot be biologically mixed or linked, except in this one little case of this great white civilization that comes over, and despite their fragility, they survive, etc. So yeah, I mean, I told it like a fairy tale, but it is kind of a fairy tale in terms of like.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's what I tell my students about the story, and I'm like, they were like, hey, because I feel like what nobody knows about the Lost Colony is they dropped a group of people off there a couple years earlier, and they came back and they're like, "What'd you find?" And they were like, "We will get the hell out of here," and they forced themselves back on the boats.
Right.
And then they come back with more people, and they're like, "Hey, this time we'll send some women. That'll make them happier, and a couple of children." And then the Spanish Armada happens. They'll come back for 3 years. And then they're like, they come back and look for him for a minute when they come to found Jamestown. And they're like, don't see him. And it's a blip to those folks. Right. But more importantly here, what's fascinating to me when you tell the story as a story of poor, innocent, fragile white folks who must have certainly been the victims of someone else, and how that relates to Lumbee, I believe it's Willard Sunderland, because he's a Russian historian. He wrote an article years ago about what happened when Russians went to the Far East and found that there were Russians, actual ethnic Russians, who had gone and joined indigenous peoples there. And they could not wrap their head around it. Why would you want to go backwards? Why would you ever want to join that group of people? Like, we're the best. That's why we're here. That was the logic. And when you tell the story like that of Lost Colony, well, then in that sense, why are we out here with these Native Americans? How did they get white ancestors? Surely they could not have voluntarily made this decision. They must have been desperate and lost behind and fragile, and they needed someone.
Captured, et cetera, victimized by savages.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this
magical thinking.
Yeah, magical thinking. Okay, so we move through this, and Lumbees have always, as you said, posed this problem, especially in a world where the European mentality is order by race and category. And you have this great line in your newest book, Lumbee Indians: An American Struggle. And the line is basically that these, I'm going to find this quote. Lumbees have consistently faced and often aggressively challenged the categories Americans use to describe people by race, tribe, or recognition status. Lumbee history suggests that the need to rationalize slavery, segregation, and the elimination of Indian people created those categories. Could you explain how this works? This is such a great line.
Yeah, so the way that Lumbee people relate to each other as members of families, as kin, our kinship networks are the basis of our identity as an indigenous people. Our relationships to place, both our home place in Robeson County and the territory between Virginia and South Carolina that our ancestors come from, speak to the kind of organic, important ways that culture is formed from mixing. Culture is formed from people colliding, coming together, figuring it out, adapting to one another's ways, asking permission to be here, seeking the right to engage authentically with hosts as guests. These are all practices of Lumbee kinship that early settlers, both black and white, adapted to. They welcomed that because they were away from home. A lot of our ancestors, English and black ancestors in North Carolina, were literally lost. They were here because they were trying to escape somewhere else in Virginia or South Carolina. So our Lumbee ancestors welcomed those folks into our community. The priority was not what place are you on the status hierarchy. The priority was, can you demonstrate your values of respect and reciprocity, and can you live with us under our authority, right? And the people who said yes, come on in. The people who are like, no, well, no thank you, go back to where you came from. The fact that this whole nation of people, the Lumbee people, were formed on those basic principles, that reciprocity and respect matter more than status and hierarchy, is a deep, deep contrast to how American society developed. American society, certainly governance and economy, developed along the lines of, well, the opposite of those values, right? We're going to enslave you. We're going to take your land. We're going to dispossess your descendants forever, or for as long as we possibly can. And in that, we are going to create an elevated group of people that get more than anybody else gets. So Lumbee history kind of disproves the logic of racial hierarchy, but it also points out in terms of all of our engagements with enslavement, for example, with not just land dispossession, but the way we've crawled back into ownership of land. All of our engagements with federal Indian policy. Our Lumbee history points to the lack of clarity that is actually embedded in the racial hierarchy. Like the lost colony thing, it has to be sustained with like a set of fictions, a kind of magical thinking that has nothing to do with people's organic way of relating to each other, and everything to do with a system of thought that gives more than they deserve to a certain group of people. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at. It's like episodes in our history clarify the ambiguity in the racial hierarchy, but our nation as itself and what constitutes that nation contradicts a system of thought that requires a hierarchy.
Or perhaps one way to look at it is, none of these things actually really exist in the way that they've been asserted. Right. I mean, race, this is one of the things that I learned studying Latin American history was, my professor at Appalachian State, Jeff Bortz, he said, you can tell race doesn't exist when you look at the Spanish in Latin America, because when they first show up, they're like, there's two types of people. There's Europeans, and then there's indigenous people. And then they're like, now we're going to bring some enslaved black people over here. And they're like, now there's three types of people. There's these tribes. And then two of the groups people have a kid together. And they're like, now that one's called this. And then two of those have a kid together. Like that one's, and then before long, there's like 8,000 categories. And it's like, okay, so what is it really?
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't actually make sense. And then even more nonsensical in the United States, those categories are completely erased into two categories: you're white or you're black. And it's like, wow, that just totally eliminates anything that is authentic to our human experience.
I pose in my classes, I talk about the Civil War, and I talk about Stan Waddy, the Cherokee. He was the only indigenous chief, only indigenous general, right, in the Confederacy. Yeah. And I asked my students, why might he have?
Hang on now. There's a lot of Confederates, and they had different interesting family connections that we don't all know about. So we know for sure he was the only citizen of the Cherokee Nation.
Okay. Okay.
But, there could be a lot of Native people serving. Yeah. We don't know.
I was going to say every white person I know who lives in the South seems to have in Native American ancestry. I don't know. What is it? Gary Fletcher used to have a joke. Our producer, he had a producer. He said he bought a white Jeep Wrangler, but it claimed to be 1/8 Cherokee. Yeah. Shout out to Gary. I wish he was still doing comedy, but we love him anyway. but so to sorry, I'm gonna so to get at these categories and the way they play out, um, you actually wrote a recent piece about the Confederate monuments, the debate over these monuments, right? To get back into this. Just to finish up what I was saying earlier, I asked my students why Stan Whitey might have been sympathetic to the Confederacy. And I say, why? And we've already talked about the centrality of slavery, and none of them can conceive that he was a slave owner.
Really?
They can't, because the dichotomy is so hard for them.
Wow.
And I say, why do you think that maybe he would have supported the Confederacy? They say, well, because the Union forced them off their land. And I was like, yeah, where was Jackson from?
And it was Jackson's Union. Yep, definitely.
Yeah, but they can't conceive of it. But you wrote this great piece in kind of earlier this year where you were talking about the debate over monuments and the idea that pro-Confederate folks are really worried that if these monuments come down, it will be erasing history. I always try to remind everybody that I will be teaching history till I die, and no amount of monuments coming down will make me forget because I'm a historian. I didn't get my history from monuments. But you pointed out an interesting term, which is actually the Confederate monuments in the debate over this does actually, even with them up, erase a story. Could you talk about the argument you made there? I thought it was brilliant.
Um, well, so it erases several things. It erases the idea that Native people have a legitimate political claim on an alliance that serves them. So Stan Waddy in this case certainly was a slave owner. He certainly had reason to ally with the Confederacy. He also had the interests of the Cherokee Nation in his mind. And in his mind, like with many leaders, their personal interest aligns perfectly with their national interest. And so Stan Waddy took that personal connection to the national interest and just went to town with it, and fought for the Confederacy. And when we take down monuments, when we construct monuments to begin with, we're upholding a set of values that often have nothing to do with the larger community of people that live in that place, right? So problem with monuments and memorials is that they often express very narrow sets of values that have little to do with our agreed shared values, why we're living together, why we agree, why we consent to a government that ostensibly represents us. Monuments are a way to just channel and make invisible any types of narratives that contradict the values of the people who erected those monuments. That's certainly the case of Confederate monuments. The other thing that I think monuments erase is the legitimate grieving that Native people have a right to of their own dispossession. So I get very tired of hearing people talk about how monuments are coming down will erase their histories, because I'm like, well, y'all will not allow us, not only can we not erect a monument, you're not allowing us to grieve how our histories have been erased. We're not allowed to mourn that. We're told to get over it, for one thing, if people recognize us at all. But we're also told that we're not Indians. So we're told that we have a fake claim on that identity, and that therefore our ancestors, the people that we memorialize in our communities, mean nothing. So when we're not allowed essentially to express our own mourning over our histories being erased, not lost, because, as you said, like, I'll be teaching history forever. Lumbee people keep history in ourselves, in our communities. The histories are not lost. The histories have been deliberately made invisible to a larger public. And monuments stand in the way of the truth and the public who needs to know that truth. So people might complain about losing something when the monuments come down. I don't think they're losing anything of real value. They're losing a lie, fundamentally. And when they lose that lie, then they can kind of see clearly what the true potential I think that American society has to offer, which is contained in our indigenous people too.
This argument about heritage,
Yeah.
it struck me recently, that this is the base argument now. I mean, the Confederacy's relationship to slavery. I think it's taken 150 years, but I think it's getting harder and harder to make that point. And then people fall back on but it's my heritage, and it just I think I've always known this, but it's really hit me hard lately. Uh, it's like, well, you're making a claim that heritage is your heritage. You're making a claim that what you're not saying that it is like one version of history. You're saying it's my heritage. It's the heritage of the country.
It's the only one that matters. And yeah, my argument is like, you don't get to claim your heritage as important when you're denying my right to my heritage. That's the old school Lumbee way of thinking about it. It's like, you don't get to do this if you're not going to let me do it. If you're going to make my people invisible or deny my native identity in the case of all of this history, not just the federal recognition issue, but like all of this history, then you don't get to mourn something that you lost, especially when that loss is a lie. All you lost was something that, is obscuring your ability to see the truth.
Yeah, and as the third great grandson of a broke Union County resident who was forced to go into the Confederate Army. And my favorite story is he abandoned before he even got to where he was going. They found him AWOL. And I always say that, he was done with the Civil War before it was over, so I'm done with it now. But it is there's a sadness for me to see how many people are still tricked by the story that led so many other folks off to die. I will say that I haven't said anything about this, but in Tennessee, right now, we have the statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest in our Capitol building. And it's now finally going to go up to the Historical Commission for removal. And I actually got on the docket to speak at the meeting 2 weeks ago. And I wanted to get you have to get interested parties listed that have like the ability to comment. And I actually got them to add the descendants of the Fort Pillow Massacre. Which are the descendants of the few black folks who lived through that slaughter, and under the idea that when we walk back and we don't have that forum for the people who that's their heritage, then we cede the ground of heritage to the people who are using it for in my opinion, many of the wrong reasons.
Absolutely.
So I want to go forward with this. Because we cannot talk about the Battle of Hayes Pond. I cannot believe. Let me just say, when I was so excited about this episode, and I was like, "Who's going to be excited with me?" And I texted Dolph Ramser, because I know him and his wife Dana, and I was like, "I think," and he called me, and we talked for like 30 minutes, and he sent me this great video, and then I dug into it. It really is one of these stories in history that I can't believe everybody doesn't tell, because it really is just, oh my, that happened. Could you set the stage for us and then explain how this story plays out? Because I think this is just such a great story.
Yeah. So in 19, I'm going to start in 1954, before the actual incident happened. So in 1954, the Supreme Court passes Brown versus Board of Education. At the same time, some Piedmont textile mills have widespread layoffs of white workers in North Carolina. And so, of course, mostly at that time, it was only whites that were working in the mills. They were not integrated spaces. And so textile mills, they're now unemployed laborers. Many of them begin to join the Klan. And so the Ku Klux Klan swells in numbers because you have all these disaffected, unemployed, otherwise, feeling the kind of assault of a change in life that Brown versus Board brings. And however that works, this is not my field. But I know that people are thinking about how those kind of economic and social conditions transform themselves into hateful activity.
Over and over and over again throughout American history. It's like if you just look back and saw it, you wouldn't be tricked. Anyway, sorry.
Right. So in 1954, you sort of see the incredible growth in the ranks of the Ku Klux Klan in North Carolina. And they begin by Union County. You're from Union County. So
Well,
in
my
Union
ancestors
County,
were. I'm sorry. I just had to clarify. That's where my up to my mother's family was from. I'm proud Cabarrus County. I just had to step in there.
your people are from Union County. So your people are confronting this reality of a growing civil rights movement all throughout rural North Carolina. And there was a, really even at that time already famous African American NAACP chairman, local chairman named Robert Williams. He lived in Monroe. And Robert Williams directly confronted the Klan with guns when they came to assault not just his home, but the home of other NAACP members. The Klan, of course, was not like symbolically burning crosses everywhere at that point. They were like violently engaged in a race war. And when they attacked Robert Williams and he shot back, he fired back with NAACP members, the Klan ran off, but didn't retreat for long. One of the places that they retreated to was South Carolina. Both of our counties are on the border of South Carolina. So they retreated to South Carolina, and their leader, a man named Catfish Cole, really, I think, was humiliated by Robert Williams's actions and decided that he was going to try to attack a seemingly more vulnerable community. And so he got wind of Robeson County. And he especially objected, or the Klan in general, this is just mimicking white supremacist ideas. This is not a unique idea to the Klan. Catfish Cole was so-called concerned about race mixing, about the ways in which Lumbee history, as we were just talking about a minute ago, affirms the logic of why people need to come together, create communities, and form political communities that serve the interests of indigenous people, right? So Catfish Cole hears all that complexity as race mixing. And so did a lot of white folks at the time. And so after this disastrous failure in Union County, he has the idea that he's going to come attack Lumbees for violating the rules of segregation in Robeson County. So in December 1955 and January 1957 and January 1958, the Ku Klux Klan burns crosses on the homes, the lawns of a couple of Lumbee families, one Lumbee woman who was dating a white man, and one Lumbee family that had moved into a white neighborhood. And so the Klan targets these people, and other Lumbee people, undoubtedly their families and their friends, are like, oh, wait, oh, hell no. What is happening elsewhere in the South where this group is victimizing people is not going to happen here. And so Catfish Cole announces that he's going to hold this rally, cross-burning and rally in Robeson County. And the sheriff of Robeson County, a man named Malcolm McLeod, went to his home in South Carolina, went to Cole's home in South Carolina and said, please don't do this. We can't, don't know if you know who you're dealing with, but we can't protect you. When we refuse to try to protect you, we're not going to protect your civil right to so-called peacefully protest because we know that's not what you're here for. This is the white sheriff of Robeson County now telling Catfish Cole this is a bad idea. Well, Cole proceeds, but he has a real hard time renting a place, basically getting a field to do this work in. But he finally finds a white landowner near the town of Maxton that will rent him the field at a place called Hayes Pond. And so in late January 1958, he travels to Hayes Pond. It's supposed to be this like big thing. He, puts up signs and broadsides and says, come sing Baptist hymns and burn crosses with us. And hear a great preacher or whatever. Catfish Cole claimed that he was a preacher too. And the whole community really had gotten wind of this work or this endeavor. And the town of Pembroke in particular, which has always been a Lumbee run town, the families in Pembroke and Lumbees, of course, live all over Robeson County, but it's between Pembroke and Maxton, especially. These families were saying, this is just unacceptable. The sheriff is not going to stop them from the Klan from coming, but, we know he's not going to protect them either. We're going to have to make an effort to stop this gathering. So the night of the planned night of the rally, Catfish Cole drives into Maxton to Hayes Pond with only, it turns out, about 50 supporters. I think he was expecting that the Klan members of Robeson County, of which there were many, would turn out to support him. And they knew, just like the sheriff did, we need to stay home.
This guy missed all the signals. He's like,
All
he's like, wait a second. A white sheriff in the South said that the Klan can't come there because he can't. They protect us everywhere else. I wonder what's. And also, our members won't show up around here. Huh?
I wonder why that is. He just missed all the cues. But he goes ahead. He's only got about 50 people with him, men, women, and children with him. He brings his wife and their children. And as he reportedly, as veterans of this event told people later, as the Klan is kind of caravanning into the site, there's already Lumbee people gathered there. There's already folks who say they're standing along the side of this dirt road with weapons, shouting, screaming, yelling at the Klan cars passing by. The media also knew about it. So there were photographers there from Fayetteville and from Raleigh and from Charlotte, to document this event. But what had happened was Catfish Cole sets up his PA and his generator and his light bulb and his microphone. And before he has a chance to speak into the microphone, a Lumbee man named Sanford Locklear yells out, "If you speak, I'm going to kill you." And Catfish Cole speaks. And Mr. Locklear takes his rifle. Now, this is a World War II veteran, and many of the Lumbee men that were there that night, it turns out there were 500 Lumbees that showed up to meet the 50 Klan members. Many of the Lumbee men that were there that night were World War II veterans. So Mr. Sanford shoots out the little light bulb that is right next to Catfish Cole's head. And so chaos erupts, it's darkness, and Lumbees begin shooting in the air, or at least they're shooting above people's heads, or what they hope is above people's heads. The Klan just scatters. Catfish Cole himself runs into the swamp. This is, like I said, a swampy area. So he's running into the swamp. He abandons his wife and child, who are sitting in the car, kind of waiting for him. She's so panicked that she drives the car into a ditch, and allegedly Lumbee men helped pull her out of the ditch. But this few minutes of chaos that was the shooting and the attempt to scare the Klan is, kind of remembered as something that, where, nobody got killed, right? That's kind of like, but the fact that nobody got killed was not exactly intentional. The Lumbee people that I've heard who participated in that night fully expected somebody to get killed. I mean, they thought they were going to get killed. They thought that they were there to kill if they had to. Fortunately, they didn't have to. I guess even though Catfish had missed all the cues, his folks got the hint really quickly and dispersed, But it was not, it was not foreordained that it would be a bloodless or injury-free event, and the fact that Lumbees exercise a degree of control over our territory, but we also know, I think, how to push someone, and push, in this case, particularly the Klan, to comply with our wishes without actually having to destroy them. So then the Klan has never come back to Robeson again, not to hold a public rally since then. And I guess it's not really surprising. Catfish Cole did wind up serving prison time for this. White juries, in this interesting way, were sympathetic with Lumbee warriors and sent him to prison.
And I'm correct that the governor of North Carolina actually knew about it and sent out the state troopers, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm. So, the state troopers were I guess doing what state troopers do, keeping order. I mean, who knows? But there was fortunately some documentation of that night because the reporters that were there, and the state troopers didn't intervene with what Lumbees were doing. I think they also knew that it wouldn't do them any good.
I think this story, I mean, there's so many things. I mean, first of all, just the whole justice thing. It's like they were like, we'll go pick on these guys out here. They'll take it. And it's like, no. But it's the story there, like what stands out to me is like like in so much of American history, there's the absence of force that's used on behalf of white folks to hold people of color down and hold marginalized groups down. But that's silenced out. Right? People go, oh, out west, when people go out west, just, take care of themselves, rugged individual. And it was like, there were people there. What do you think happened to them? They were like, they sent out the U.S. Army to clear out the space that the people lived. But when I went out there was no government. It was like, I'm pretty sure that was government intervention. You use the federal military to force people off. Yeah. But it's more subtle than that, too, because like what you just told was a story where no arbiters of violence stepped in on behalf of the white nationalists.
Right. And Lumbees at that point, I mean, we had hundreds and hundreds of years of encounters with Europeans to demonstrate to them that we were not to be messed with. And especially when it comes to our territory. So, many of the reasons that we are have been in a compromised state economically is because people have found other ways to dispossess us of our wealth. Culturally as well as materially, but you just can't bring violence to the Lumbee community and get away with it for very long. Our history just demonstrates that.
Yeah, it's also bizarre that you have to even say something like that.
I know.
Isn't it? You're like, hey, don't bring violence here, guys. We won't put up with it. It's like,
why do we even have to deal with that question?
Yeah.
But that's white supremacy at work. Again, there's this, it's hard, as Tim Tyson says, it's hard work to maintain white supremacy. And they have to use violence in order to do it, and they get met with the same thing. So
Tim Tyson, by the way, Radio Free Dixie, the other guy who won the shootout had to go to Cuba.
Yep. Robert Williams had to go to Cuba. Tim Tyson yeah.
Fascinating story. I got two last questions for you, if you've got time. Yeah. First of all, you in this book, your more recent book, The Lumbee Indians: An American Struggle from 2018, you talk about your daughter, who I guess now is 6 or 7.
At that point, when the book opened, she was 4.
4, yeah. So I was saying, like, now she's yeah, time flies. But you talk about the Lumbee story, and you tell a story about her and how she'll go to school and she will learn American history, and at home she will learn her people's history. And I wonder, you're in a unique spot because you're the at-home.
Right.
So that means that you have kind of the informal narrative where school is the formal narrative that's being taught. And you are at the same time teaching your daughter as a mother, but also as a historian.
Right.
So what is your approach to teaching a story? When you sit down with your daughter, how do you do that? How do you tell her a story that makes her be able to be proud and feel included in both stories?
Can you give me a second? Let me ask her.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Lydia, can you come in here?
This is amazing.
One of the things we don't do is sit down and talk about it. Can you tell these folks? This is Ben.
Hello.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I am going to turn on my own camera for a second. So do you want to can you see yourself?
Yeah.
Yep, there you go. Hi.
Hi.
So Mr. Ben just asked, when we talk about Lumbee history, how do we do it? And also, what is there anything that we talk about that makes it come alive for you?
I think history is really a good thing that comes alive. the experience, and just really, honestly, I love food, so the food really comes to life.
Right.
But I really think it's really food, everything, really. Even books, stories of people who descend way back, and I think it's really good and interesting that we know all those people, or we heard of them.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think I'm saying it correctly?
Yeah. So you're talking about our ancestors.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is there an ancestor that you just happen to think of that's like that you remember that feels?
Well, my father, I guess.
Willie,
yes. But also Henry Berry Lowery. I don't really know much about him, but I think he was a really strong person.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's remarkable that when you asked your daughter, Malinda, Lydia, right? I want to make sure I could. That when you asked Lydia what she knows about history, the first thing she brought up was food. And we, like, as historians, we understand the intricate relationship, but you kind of have to, like, in a way, you have to kind of get there, like, through some discourse and some ideology a lot of the time, you know, or some way of thinking. But, like, you've clearly taught her that, like, the history is in.
History's in our food.
Yeah.
It's really true. I know collard greens you can eat all around the world, but it's really, like, when I think of it, I think of Lumbee food.
Mm-hmm.
That's
really
awesome.
Something special about Lumbee collard greens that speaks to our history.
I'm going to have to find that recipe.
Yeah, so we're kind of learning by doing. If I had to give an answer to sum up what Lydia said, it would be that we learn history by doing, by belonging to the community.
Singing is also
Singing.
Like she always mentions in churches, we talk by singing. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. We worship by singing.
We worship by singing. And yeah, it really comes to life.
And the feeling that you're doing something that your ancestors did, I think we're conscious of that. And so but then when I can maybe like insert a historical detail
Yeah.
about an ancestor, I don't know if it resonates, but like that's what I get sort of special pleasure, I think, about inserting a historical detail to something.
Yeah. No, that's great. It's funny because I phrased the question in a way that I actually is contrary to the way that I probably think about things, which is I'm constantly reinforcing to the students that I teach that you can only think you don't like history if you think it's a subject, if you think it's a thing in a book and that's all it is, and that it's not all around you. And you've clearly taught your daughter that. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's all around us. It's in us. It's in our land. And so one of the things I love about writing Lumbee history is being able to go to a spot in the Lumbee community and say, I have a sense of what happened here in 1810. I have a sense of what happened here in 1870. I have a sense of what happened here in 1950. And so being able to recognize, you said, geography is huge in American history. It's huge in American history because it's huge in Indigenous history.
I think even more so, it's the way space works.
Mm-hmm.
I think, this is something I've been thinking about a lot about lately, is that right now, so many people are having trouble, like during this coronavirus lockdown, people are having trouble kind of remembering things. People are having trouble keeping things organized, and they feel overwhelmed. And that has made me aware in a heightened way of how much just space matters to even your sense of self. And I think about how amazing it must be to go to these places and remember your own past, and then how that intersects with other people's pasts, with your other ancestors' past. That must be amazing.
Makes it very clear. Lumbee history just makes all that very clear. It wouldn't be what it is without attachment or certain places where we talk about it as where our ancestors are buried too. When Lydia was 4, when the book opens, we used to drive into Pembroke, or the area right around Pembroke, and we'd say, "Hello, Pembroke," or "Hello, Scuffletown," and then Scuffletown one of us would be Pembroke and the other would be Lydia, and we'd have this little dialogue with the place as a greeting and, as just another device to help us know where we were and who we were.
That's brilliant. The last question for you is this. You are Lumbee, and you are also one of the most prolific scholars in your field. You study your people, and you study that from an academic perspective, and I imagine that must be difficult sometimes. But I wonder, how did you decide to pursue this field? What led you to taking this path academically?
Good question. I think it was a series of fortuitous events. It was a series of people that I met, a series of connections that I was able to make. It started really for me as a filmmaker, learning about documentary film, learning about especially what historical documentary or documentaries that resonate with historical issues, what creating and writing those were like, and beginning to understand that I spent my first career as a filmmaker. If I was going to make documentaries, I needed to look at things that mainstream American society was not looking at. And you don't have to look far, hello, Lumbees, to find something that mainstream society is not looking at. And which at the same time was, they're not looking because they're not interested. They're looking because they're not looking because the story is a little too complicated. It doesn't match our kind of neat constructions of place or identity in the United States. So, I'm always, I think temperamentally, I'm inclined to be overcomplicated. And so if I could bring forth a story that was going to make a complex narrative accessible to people, there was like no better place to start than Lumbee history, and be able to affirm at the same time why Indigenous people everywhere are central to American history. And so that, in a sense, I guess, has been my lifelong ambition, to make people aware of how Indigenous people are central to American history, and vice versa, but, mostly the former.
That makes so much sense. I'll just wrap this up, but I want to say, when I was reading this book, your newest one, the Lumbee Indians, the way that you talk about story, the way you talk about origins, the way you talk about these moments and interacting narratives, it struck me that you've thought a lot about storytelling.
I've listened to a lot of stories. Crafting stories in filmmaking is instructive for any other kind of storytelling. But, being a storyteller is still something I want to be. It's not something that I am. It's something that I want to be. I've really benefited, and I was speaking to another Lumbee PhD student today, Conchetta Bullard. She was reminding me of how important the practice of visiting is in the Lumbee community, how many sort of stories we hear as we're visiting with relatives and with elders. And those stories are not like beginning, middle, and end. It's not like animal folk tales or something that we're not sitting around a fire and listening to the history. What we're doing is hearing genealogies. We're hearing about our ancestors. We're hearing their relationships to one another. And that process of understanding our kinship relations are how we hear stories, how we tell stories. So it just reminds me as a person, and I try to instill this in Lydia too, that we're a small part of an unbroken chain of individuals who have intentionally made space in their lives to continue relationships and to teach and to learn. And so just as we're descendants, we're also going to be ancestors, and we have to act in ways that our descendants will find that they'll be proud of, and that we have to act in ways that our descendants will find useful for their own lives. So I guess that's what storytelling is to me. It's just reminding yourself of this, the fact that you're part of this unbroken lineage, not just sort of family lineage, but community lineage, historical lineage.
That is a fantastic place to wrap up this conversation. That was amazing. Dr. Malinda Maynor Lowery, thank you so much for being here. And Lydia, thank you for joining us too. And you know what? Go right now. Everybody listening. Go give a phone call to somebody you love, your elder. We're all isolated, and we can't do it exactly like Dr. Lowery did, but we can do it in our own way.
Yes, go call your relative and go do some phone banking for some candidates that you support. Get out the vote.